Just a quick heads up before we start today. Today's episode features some brief depictions of sexual and physical violence that might be unsettling for some listeners. If that kind of thing isn't for you, you might want to skip this one. All right, let's get on with the show. We live in a content-saturated media landscape. Since the birth of Netflix's streaming service in 2007, there's been a steady exponential explosion of online media and media platforms. It seems that every month we have a new streaming app, and every app offers dozens to hundreds of brand new original series and movies. Society has gone from being at the receiving end of a monoculture conveyor belt to scavengers in a wasteland of varied and disparate small-scale and blockbuster offerings. Media companies have had to change their entire approach to the way they create content for audiences, because they have to fight tooth and nail just for a second of attention. The things that do float to the surface these days are assigned unusual adjectives. They're called binge-worthy, addictive. They're characterized more akin to the way we talk about narcotics than traditional pieces of art. Streamers aren't in the business of making movies or television. They're in the business of stealing your attention. In the wake of this media overhaul, there's one genre that has come out on top. One genre that has captured the attention of millions and consistently sits at the top of the charts. That genre is true crime. Aidan Healey is a senior here at UNCW, and he's been examining the murky depths of this cultural phenomenon. Sifting through dead bodies and murder weapons, his senior thesis is dedicated to the analysis and unearthing of the origins of the true crime genre. He has traced a line all the way back through the decades to the mid-century novelist Truman Capote and his infamous non-fiction novel. Capote's In Cold Blood, he believes, is the catalyst for all of our bloodlust and intrigue for scandal. It's the beginning of popularized crime dramas and macabre documentaries. Today, he's here to discuss all things Capote, true crime, streaming, and the intriguing liberties taken in non-fiction storytelling. From Audacious Media and the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, you're listening to the Relevate Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Charles Wright. Let's begin, shall we? Aidan, thank you for being here.
Of course, wouldn't be anywhere else. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, I'm really happy that you're here. What inspired you to start looking into Capote and his nonfiction novel?
Yeah, well, honestly, it started like every sort of project, every rabbit hole I end up going down and researching, which is just, I had an emotional reaction to something. And that something was one of the things I discuss in my paper, which was the Jeffrey Dahmer monster series on Netflix starring Evan Peters.
Which is very good. I really enjoyed that show.
It's very good. It is, oh man, there's a lot to unpack there. A lot to unpack there. So me and some of my friends were going through a phase. You know, we're horror fans. One day I walked into my roommate who was watching this show, and I forget exactly what particular scene it was, but I just remember having this like sinking weird feeling. Like I was just kind of put off by it. And I don't mean
like you were watching a serial killer?
Something like that. Yeah, exactly. And like that's just not a feeling I usually have for, like I have a pretty strong stomach when it comes to this stuff. And I really was interested in examining that feeling and sort of seeing where it came from. You know, what was different here that maybe other true crime documentaries, other series, other horror isn't doing. And so I talked with Dr. Harris, who's now my thesis advisor, and we worked together and we sort of honed in on In Cold Blood. She suggested that book be a part of my paper. I read it. I had a strong emotional reaction. I knew there was a lot there to discuss. And so it became the focus of my paper, and I'm really happy it did because, again, lots to discuss there. So I'm excited to get into it.
For context, let's talk about the post-Netflix boom in true crime content and sort of the unique methodologies that this genre uses in its storytelling. You talk about that in your paper.
Yeah. Well, first, I think it's important to establish why this genre. Why in this period of time has true crime become more popular than it's ever been? And it comes down to a couple things. First of all, these services like Netflix, because it's a unique method, or not unique, but a new method of sort of consuming media via subscription, these services need a constant stream of content to keep people engaged, to keep people from unsubscribing, which is called churn, the sort of constant cycle of people subscribing and unsubscribing, coming back for the content they want to watch, and then leaving when there's nothing there they feel interested in. To stop that from happening, these services are trying to put out a constant stream of content, a constant stream of things to like catch your eye and be interested in, and oh, this is something new. This is something eye-catching. I'm going to stay subscribed and be engaged in this platform. And obviously that's an expensive thing to do. That's a lot of content. That's a lot. I mean, everyone listening to this knows. Everyone listening to this is engaged with Netflix or Hulu or something like that and sees those things happening, sees the constant stream of things and put in front of them. And hence true crime, which is a perfect sort of type of content for this model. It's very eye-catching, very sensational. And most of all, most of it is very cheap to produce, especially the documentary style. Obviously, they need to get interviews, they need to put footage together. It's not easy by any means, but it is cheaper than hiring actors, directors, all these sort of special effects. A lot of these shows use special effects, and that's not needed here. So for that model, it just fits like a glove, really.
Sometimes the cheapness of it is tangible when you're watching a true crime documentary and they use the same B footage over and over and over again. It's like the same slow motion shot of a girl walking down the hallway. You're like, I think I've seen this 30-second footage maybe 13 times today. Absolutely,
the same stock suspense music. It's like the person says something suspenseful, and then you hear that music roll, and it's like I've heard that in 30 other series.
Yes.
But no, it is tangible though, for sure. And I think that's why, because they've cultivated that audience, they've sort of tried to move into the upper echelons, give these projects bigger budgets. Hence things like Monster, which is created by the person who makes American Horror Story, and stars of big people like Evan Peters, like movie stars. And they're able to, by mimicking the sort of genre and the trends of fiction, elevate true crime beyond that cheapness into something that they're more willing to put on the banner and be like, hey, this is a Netflix series. Jeffrey Dahmer is a Netflix icon, which is a crazy thing to say, but it's true. It's
a wild statement.
I think it's a fair statement to make. Yeah, so that's why this genre is so relevant, why it's so popular, more popular than it's ever been, and why it's important to discuss, because it's really being jammed down people's throats. It's a huge part of pop culture, and I think it's important to sort of figure out why and what makes that so relevant.
Yeah. Can you expand on some of the subgenres of true crime, their features, and how their methods affect viewer-listener experience?
Yeah, so there's a couple different types of true crime. I mean, obviously there's tons of different types of true crime. What I really wanted to focus in on my paper was this disparity between the documentary true crime and the dramatization true crime. Documentary true crime being what you usually would expect, this sort of, it uses the conventions of documentary. It uses footage and stock music and interviews, and it sort of weaves them together to create this narrative. And, done well, it can create this feeling of dramatic tension. It leads you through the events, typically chronologically, to sort of reenact that.
But also sometimes not chronologically, to build suspense.
Absolutely. And that's a whole thing we can get into with In Cold Blood in particular. But they're typically woven together using pre-existing material as a foundation, which is an important distinction from dramatized true crime, which I akin more to like the Jeffrey Dahmer Netflix series, which are more willing to use the conventions of fiction and typically traditional series. They write out the dialogue and they have actors playing, there's directors. There's a lot of different moving parts there that create this story. And obviously they're using evidence as this foundation, but they're a lot less limited to using it than documentary true crime in a way that creates a lot of opportunities for creative liberties and for things to be taken out of context and for things to be changed. And I think it's important to dissect how those opportunities are being taken and how that affects both the people and events being portrayed and the audiences that are engaging with it. There's a source I've been using, Richter, who has this sort of ethical lens that he applies to these things. And he has this term called bad history, which is giving the audience the illusory sense of having actually experienced as true what may be only speculation and wild speculation at that. Which is really, in some ways, that's the core of my project, is speculation and creative liberty being presented to the audience as fact. And I think that is something that should be noticed and properly criticized when those stories are being misrepresented.
Yeah. Let's take a step back just for a second and touch on something that I talked about in the intro, in that, for better or worse, the way that we consume media has drastically shifted in the last 10 to 15 years. This is a big question, but what have been some of the biggest changes that you have noticed in the kinds of content that are being created now for public consumption? And do you think that this is good or bad for viewers and creators?
Yeah. Oh man, that is a big question.
There could be a whole podcast on just that question.
Absolutely. And I think this is sort of going off what we just talked about, but I think to me the most noticeable trend has been just disposability. like you said in the intro, we used to live in such a monoculture. You know, everyone was being exposed and being influenced by the same things, and that's not true anymore. And I think that has a lot. I think you see that in the world today, and how different people are, and how fractured people's echo chambers are. And I think part of it is just how much there is and how quickly it goes by. With Netflix in particular, the binge model, dropping whole series that people have worked years on. I mean, people have slaved away at this. Like these conditions are not good. The workers who are working on these are not being appreciated in the way they should be. And it's just gone in a flash, typically. I mean, obviously there's standouts, but I mean, for every Stranger Things, how many canceled things are there? It's like a lot of them.
Probably the majority of them, because the things that succeed are much less than the things that don't succeed.
Absolutely. And I think these services have cultivated this culture of moving on to the next thing, of anticipation. Whereas this art that people are creating deserves to be appreciated and digested and talked about in a way that really can elevate both the material and the culture around the material, you know? And, you know, is it bad for creators and viewers? I mean, I think it is bad for creators personally. I mean, you see that in, obviously, writer strikes and actor strikes that occurred not too long ago. Through these models, these people don't get paid in the same way they used to, and because of that, they're having a hard time keeping work and, you know, having stable ways to live and to survive in these, you know, in the expensive places they live. For viewers, I think asking if it's bad for viewers is a harder question, because obviously there's more. And in that culture, more is what people want. It's like people are always looking for the next big thing. People are always looking to move on. There's not a lot of time to digest. And I think I'd probably say it is, but, you know, it's such a big question. It's like, I think in the culture we have today, these services are giving people what they want, but I don't know if what people want is what they should have. You know what I mean? I think especially with the rise of AI, with this disposability, people appreciating the work that goes into these things a little bit more would show that sort of stuff is not tenable, and appreciate the creatives for what they do, because I think they do incredible work always, and that work needs to be given the proper limelight.
Yeah. As somebody who writes creatively in many mediums, I think about this a lot, and I think about the change that I've seen in my lifetime, from the monoculture to the monoculture dying, because that's something that we've seen happen in the last 10 to 15 years. And I have trouble deciding whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, because I think that it is wonderful that so much more art is being created at such a high level, that you have places like Netflix, Amazon, HBO, FX, Hulu. Like, we have all of these companies that are making, a lot of times, really excellent television, like really excellent shows, and it's giving so many more writers and such a more diverse group of writers a chance to create the things that they've been writing and working on for years. And I think that that's awesome. But at the same time, it has also then massively devalued the art. It has devalued the work that all these people are doing because of the muchness of it. There's just too much. So like I said in my intro, with there being, I really do feel like every month we get a new streaming platform that has all of these new things. Like, we've got the Peacock, and we've got Paramount Plus, and we've got AMC Plus, and we've got all of these. I mean, it's just all of these things. And most of them, like, I'm tapped out. I can't do another streaming service. One, I can't pay for another streaming service. The whole endeavor has become, if you were to own a subscription to every streaming service, it's a mortgage. Yeah, your bill is so much more than just having cable used to be. Like, it's wild. And it was supposed to be the cheaper but still high quality alternative. And now it's just turned into this thing where you're like, oh no, now it's way more expensive if you were to actually want to watch everything.
It is fascinating how they've sort of recreated that model in a weird way. It's like they've tried something new and it didn't work. So they sort of just went back to what did in this roundabout way. Yep. It's like, sorry, Quibi, I don't have the money for Quibi. I don't have the money for you. It's like,
and Roku. I'm just not. When the Weird Al movie came out with Daniel Radcliffe, I wanted to see it so bad.
It looks so good.
It looks fantastic. I was like, I don't even know how to get Roku, and I'm not going to. I'm sorry. I have to wait for this to be available somewhere else. But then on the other end, for the viewers too, I also have like a love-hate relationship with it, where I think that it's awesome that there is so many more corners of content to get lost in, for people to find like their tastes and things that they're really into in really specific ways, and be like, this is what I'm really into. I'm like, oh, I am really into the live action versions of anime shows. How about that? I was like, that's not something. Yeah, exactly. Like, the One Piece is fantastic. I could sort of consider Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's like, anime adjacent. It's like a gateway drug to anime. And the live action first season of that show is awesome. I
haven't seen it yet, but I need to.
So
I
good.
love that show.
Yeah, and when they put the cartoon on Netflix, I watched it like 3 times in a row, back to back. I just finished it, and I was like, I'm not done. I'm just going to start this over. I love it so much. But then at the same time, watching the monoculture die for a viewing audience has also been a weird experience where we actually, like I said, it's a give and take, because it's wonderful that everybody can have their own thing and enjoy watching in their own spaces, but there's so much less community around watching things now. Like, we all used to go see the Harry Potter movies at midnight. We all used to go see the Avengers movies, those aren't, well, the Harry Potter movies are great, but that isn't like high quality cinema or anything, but there was a community element to it, and now we've sort of lost that.
And I think the community element really elevates those things. It's like, would I like Marvel movies if I didn't get to talk with them with my friends and and discuss those things online? Like, probably not. Yeah. At least not to that extent. And I think that is prevalent for everything. I mean, I really do think that community engagement elevates things. Yeah. I mean, not to go off on this, but after the live action One Piece, I started reading the manga, and I was like, oh man, I don't know anyone who I could talk to this about in real life. And I love that series, but it's like, I really wish I could have that community around it, that we could have that bubble and be engaged together.
Yeah. It makes me think of watching people of my generation exist in a media landscape, and then thinking about people in like my parents' media landscape for Gen X. It's like, they all loved Empire Strikes Back. They all loved Back to the Future. They all loved Indiana Jones. And they all they all just loved the same big blockbuster movies. And so they all had things in common. They had things to talk about, and they still love them now. And it's like, with the huge ocean of content to swim through, we were all obsessed with Bird Box 7 years ago. When we're 40, are we going to talk about Bird Box? Probably not.
I have a hard time believing that. It is weird. It's like, it is going to be so interesting to see what survives the cataclysmic wave of content I heard somewhere. What is able to make themselves known and stay in the limelight during those things? It's so interesting. It's going to be so interesting to reflect in like 15, 20 years and be like, Bullet Train is still around. It's like, well, I wouldn't have expected that. How weird is that?
That's so funny.
But I'll be excited to see. Again, it's just such an interesting landscape to analyze, and I think these massive changes do deserve to be given that reflection. And we'll get into the importance of the humanities and what we do a little bit later, but I think that changing culture is reflective of us, and I think that's important to talk about and to be introspective about.
All right, let's dive back into your paper. In Cold Blood, the Truman Capote work at the center of your analysis was met with a lot of praise from the literary community when it came out in 1966, but a lot of critics did doubt the veracity of some of the book's claims, which is interesting that they loved it, but they also said that this probably isn't all totally true, because Capote believed that everything in the book was absolutely factual, despite many of the scenes being proven to be fabrications. How did you approach studying this richly complicated piece of writing, and what are your thoughts on his project?
Yeah, so, oh man, I have a lot of thoughts on this project, as you could probably tell from my large paper on it. It was interesting. When I read In Cold Blood, it was suggested for me to be a part of my project and to think about. But when I went into it, it wasn't the centerpiece. It wasn't something I knew that was going to influence my project so greatly. And so when I went into it, and I was, truly taken by... Capote's a master, clearly. He like, the way he writes his story was so engaged. The last time I read a book in like 2 days was years ago, until In Cold Blood, and he just got me back there, man. It's just such an impressive work, truly an opus, I would say. And talking about those claims, it's like, for me, it's easy to see how those people were taken by that, and how they were like, oh, this is such an impressive work, and he's saying it's factual. So, if he's so good at this, why would he be lying about that? Or why would he be misrepresenting himself and his work? It just speaks to the literary power of the book. But again, having that strong emotional reaction to it and diving deeper into it further, looking up sources and talking about how the book functions, the problems became known pretty quickly. And while literary journalism exists, and this is obviously an example of that, it is such a powerful piece of literature. The claim that it's factually spotless, it's impossible to be true. There's absolutely zero chance. We can get into a little bit about why that is, but it's just a misrepresentation of what the book is. And I think it's really interesting to approach it with that sort of skeptical lens and be like, these people all died. How do you know that happened? Or why are we spending so much time in this person's stream of consciousness who you communicated with in person like 4 times? How do you know that? There are rhetorical tools that Capote uses that make his literature so powerful, but they are inherently sort of incompatible with the nonfiction aspect. They're at war with each other.
I feel like the novel exists as a paradox. It's just,
yes.
To say that this is a nonfiction novel is like saying jumbo shrimp. It doesn't make sense.
Yes, and that was sort of a big part of my project. Literary journalism is this fascinating thing. The definition of literary journalism is so broad. It's just the components of literature, doing the fusion dance with the components of journalism, and it's really fascinating. This piece stands as such an incredible version of that, but they don't work together. And when you sort of approach that from a lens and you talk about how they don't work together, it makes you see the book in a whole new light. And I truly don't think this would be a problem if Capote wasn't so firmly adamant that it was factual. It's like if you would just say that you took, when you hear based on a true story in a movie trailer or anything, no one believes that.
No,
obviously.
You know that most of everything has been changed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a cultural expectation now in a way that I don't think it was back then. And I think that's why a lot of people did buy into the novel.
So, yeah, Capote hoped that his book would not just be a literary success, but that it would be a groundbreaking feat in the field of journalism. He really thought that journalists would look back on this book and be like, this is where, everything changed. How did his novel influence nonfiction storytelling? And did it become the journalistic triumph that he anticipated?
Yeah, so I don't think so, which is sort of the crux of the paper. It's so interesting diving deep into these sort of reviews and reflections on In Cold Blood, because a lot of the ones right after it came out did buy into the factualness of the book. Mm-hmm. And part of that's because everyone knew what it was about before it came out. The nonfiction aspect was kind of a selling point, a novelty in a way. Because when it arrived at their doorsteps, people were willing to buy into that because it was such an important part of how the book was presented to them, which is really fascinating because in recent years, those criticisms get a lot more in depth and people start to point out those things that don't quite make sense. One of Capote's fact checkers while he was writing the book, and one of those scenes at the beginning where it's just the Clutter family who were the victims in this case, he wrote, "How no?" next to this part. And it's a great question. How no? It's like...
How no? How you know?
Yeah, that, again, it just doesn't add up in that sort of sense. And a scholar named Eric Hine really sort of encapsulated this cultural conversation when he said, there's a strong tendency among critics to talk about the book as a kind of novel. And that's because those are the rhetorical tools that Capote's using to tell the story. You don't see the nonfiction. It feels like fiction, which again, I think makes it a strong piece of literature, but not the journalistic triumph that he would like it to be. And so I think that's sort of where I come down on that.
Yeah, it does seem fairly antithetical to what good journalism is supposed to be, where when you read an investigative journalism piece from the New York Times, you don't want the author to give you all of their flowery language and their own takes and what they think was going on in the heads of the people they were interviewing, because that's not helpful. It doesn't tell you the factual information about what you're actually trying to get out of the piece that you're reading. So to novelize something is great, you wrote a great book, but you just can't call it journalism.
I totally agree. What really encapsulates that me is the portrayal of the killers, Perry, Smith, and Dick Hickok, because there's such an obvious bias towards Perry in the novel. It's kind of insane looking back, looking at it through that lens. Perry is truly the main character. Capote is very interested in psychoanalyzing him and figuring out what makes him tick. The reader spends a lot of time in Perry's stream of consciousness, learning what he knows, his philosophies, his pasts, and what makes him tick. And Dick gets none of the same treatment. There's literally zero. In fact,
sideline.
No, they're used as foils for each other. And obviously this is loosely based on real events, but Dick is used to make Perry look better throughout most of the novel. There's this is sort of like a trigger warning thing for assault, but there's a point in the novel where Dick is thinking about assaulting a young girl. And Perry stops him. He looks at that as a disgusting, irreprehensible thing. And obviously we're speaking in degrees of evil here, so it's all muddied, but that's a good thing that he did that, It's obviously we don't want that to happen. That endears us to him, and because we're spending so much time in his stream of consciousness, we are learning so much about his past, and it makes us sympathetic to him. It's just so interesting that bias is so obviously present. It's like Capote saw a spark in Perry, a spark of nuance, a spark of, oh, there's more here than just what happened that night at the Clutter farm. And he didn't see that in Dick. And it's just it really is just so obvious in the text. It's kind of insane.
Yeah, it is interesting. And it's also, I could see where it could potentially be rather dangerous when you start to have serial killers be the main characters of your novels and you make them very sympathetic characters. And then the court of public opinion then becomes like, oh, well, Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't that bad of a guy. Look how tortured he was. And it's like, whoa.
Yes.
Hold on.
Absolutely. And the reason I think Capote somewhat dodges this is because he pulls the rug back at one point. A centerpiece of my paper is that Capote is absolutely interested in the sympathetic serial killer and understanding why this person does what they do. But when these men are eventually caught in the final saga of the book, Perry recounts the events. And this is the first time we've go in detail about what happened that night. Everything up to that point was very ambiguous. It's like, oh, we killed those people, but we don't see it happen very viscerally. And that's sort of what lets us be endeared to him, is that, oh, we know that happened, but we didn't like experience it. And here's where we experience it. And you truly see how sort of heartless and just how systematic it was. Perry describes what he did, his killing the husband, Mr. Clutter. He says, I didn't realize what I'd done until I heard the sound. Then I aimed the gun. The room just exploded, went up, just blazed blue. He says, I didn't want to harm the man. I thought he was a very nice gentleman. I thought so right up until the moment I cut his throat, which is just such a visceral line. And knowing that these people went to kill the entire family after that happened, it's just so gut-wrenching. It really does strip that appeal away. It's almost like Capote being like, oh, I got you there, didn't I? It's like you were feeling bad for this person, and now you understand what he did so viscerally. Like, what a fascinating rhetorical trick to do, really playing the reader into his hands. I think that was the moment I realized what a magnificent piece of literature this was. But it does create the aesthetic of that sympathetic serial killer, and it is very entrenched in the DNA of that book. And I don't think, going back to like Monster and the Jeffrey Dahmer stuff, they sort of don't have that same sort of rug pull. You know what I mean? You experience what he's doing, but they don't make it such a visceral experience where you like catch yourself falling for him. They interweave that sympathy with throughout. And so you're sort of left with the aesthetic of the killer and not necessarily the literary substance that made it so powerful. And I think that's in a lot of ways, that's the legacy of In Cold Blood, which is frustrating because it's not what Capote's doing, but it is the aesthetic he created. Or he didn't create, but he gave literary credence to.
Huh, that's interesting. You've touched on this a little bit already, but how else do you see Capote's work influence the true crime genre now?
Again, I think part of it is just the willingness to go beyond fact. Capote didn't invent true crime, but he gave it this sort of artistic credence. It's like, oh, this is not just a grocery store like on the shelf, grab for like $5 or something. This can be really high art. And that was a gateway for a lot of people to engage with it themselves. He's interested in psychoanalyzing these people. He's interested in the why these people do the things they do, what created these monsters so far from our understanding that they would be willing to do these things. And it's so interesting because when it does evolve into being like Jeffrey Dahmer, it's like Jeffrey Dahmer's story is very well documented. There's no need for more documentation really on Jeffrey Dahmer. People know him. People know what he did, generally at least. And so that can't have been the purpose for the show. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
it has to go beyond that. And I think looking at it through that aesthetic, especially knowing it's Ryan Murphy who created American Horror Story, and it's just...
And Glee.
And Glee.
Don't forget Glee.
I wouldn't say that as like a necessarily better thing. It's like
a different kind of horror.
Glee is the most horrific one of all three.
Ryan Murphy's scariest work.
No, it is fascinating. It's like that style is so prevalent in there. It's like these are real people affected in that American Horror Story, that Glee style. Like, you see that influence.
You do. Oh, yeah. The way that he films a show is very striking.
Yes. And I remember a critic described it as his salacious style. I was like, yeah, that's a good way. That's going to the paper.
Oh, yeah. That's a good description.
Yeah. And I think it takes that novelty of being the novelty of something so macabre and so horrific being based on real life, and it just sort of highlights that above all else. And I truly think that being based on real life as a novelty is so integral to these things. It's like, would this show be so influential or so important if it was totally made up? I have my doubts.
Probably not. I think that the whole based on a true story aspect of most movies I mean, that's the whole draw.
Yeah.
I can think it doesn't even have to be murder mystery movies. A lot of movies, like I just think of like Invincible, the Mark Wahlberg football movie. It's just not a very good movie, but I think that we think that it's more interesting because it's true. Like, because it is true, it's a far more interesting film than if it were just a football movie that somebody wrote.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I think analyzing that, basis in factivity as a marketing thing rather than a super intrinsic element of the story, it's a deep perspective shift, and I think it sort of shines a light on a lot of how these pieces of media are functioning.
The nonfiction novel is not a literary invention that had a lot of staying power, much to the ghost of Truman Capote's dismay. What are some of the major failures in Capote's endeavor?
The nature of it is just inherently paradoxical. The tenets of great fiction, character, theme, story structure, obviously that's a very broad way to put it, but these things that typically you think of when you think of the great works of fiction, they're not possible through journalism. Not really. Having that strong basis in fact, it doesn't allow those things to really flourish in the way that, I'm sure Capote wanted to when he had the idea for the nonfiction novel and saw the clutter incident as a way to do that. It's really just at their core incompatible, I feel. And that's not to say that literary journalism, which again is a super broad term, could apply to a ton of different things. I'm actually writing a paper for my senior sem about how broad it is and how In Cold Blood and a novel called Democracy by Joan Didion are almost the inverse of each other. And they're both labeled literary journalism because Capote is telling a real life story and taking himself out of the narrative. And Didion is creating a fiction story using the tenets of journalism. It's all fake, but she's like just portraying it as a real life story. And she's inserting her like a fictional version of herself into the action of the story. And these things could not be more different. Like those are essentially, I describe it as sort of being two sides of the same coin in a really fascinating way, but they're both literary journalism and they're operating so differently. And I do think literary journalism can be a super engaging form of writing. It's like I said, every example of literary journalism, like the two I just mentioned, for example, have been incredibly engaging. But the problem stems when there is that mindset that Capote had where this is inscrutable fact. There's no wiggle room in the sort of fiction of this in this book. And he eventually admitted, like, for example, the final scene, which features the detective Alvin Dewey meeting with one of the murdered girl's friends a couple years after the fact and having this moment of reflection. A great ending to the book, a great ending scene. But Capote did eventually, years after In Cold Blood, admit that was not real. that didn't happen. And so the inscrutability really catches up with you. And I think labeling what it is, where this is a literary interpretation of journalism that exists as this fascinating thing, but it's not necessarily 100% real. I think that is the main issue with Capote, is that he is just unable to accept that.
The problem there is the need for a writer / the need for a reader to want satisfaction from what they're reading / writing. Mm-hmm. And real life is very often not satisfying.
Exactly.
And so when you're writing real life, and there's a lot of examples of this that authors will intentionally leave you with an unsatisfying ending because that's the point. But Capote clearly didn't do that. He wasn't satisfied with the way the real story ended, so he fabricated his own ending, and that's dishonest. And it's like, well, if you can't claim it to be factual if you made up a whole scene that didn't happen.
Oh my gosh, this is so fascinating because he was writing this book while these people were in jail, on death row, Perry and Dick waiting to be executed. He occasionally communicated with them via letter, mostly via letter. He met with them in person, I think 4, 5, 6, somewhere in that realm of times. And he had to keep postponing the book because they hadn't been executed yet.
He's like, this can't come out while they're still alive. They'll ruin it.
But legitimately, like, he was very deliberately waiting for these people because their execution kept being stayed because they kept like, oh my gosh. And this is the whole premise of the Capote movie, like the biopic that came out starring Philip Seymour Hoffman, where he's like falling apart because he's supposed to be helping these people survive, like get out of death row. Like, he pitches it in that movie, at least, as this thing that could help portray them as innocent.
It's like a character reference almost.
Exactly, absolutely. And all this time he's like putting it off. He's like, man, the ending of my book, he knew the ending of the book was the execution, and that's what it is besides that little addendum I mentioned. Again, just what a fascinating limitation. And I think it speaks to, I mean, Capote never wrote another complete book after this. And there's a sort of a section of the literary community that says that this book and how he handled it cursed him, which is a really funny way to put it. What happens when he tackled the medium with the perspective he did, wanting to create this fully satisfying story with this fully satisfying ending, and that's what that required. It's just so interesting.
So let's talk about the film portrayal of Capote. How did you feel that film tackled the character of Capote? What are your opinions on it, basically?
I think this is a really fascinating movie and a really good one as well. It's directed by Bennett Miller, starring Philip Seymour Hoffman, who's just obviously a complete, like, a legend. The portrayal of Capote, I think, is truly, especially Hoffman's acting, is incredible. But it's so interesting because the movie actually mimics a lot of the problems that In Cold Blood has, which is either highly ironic or a genius level move.
I'd like to think that the director, that was his intention.
I'd like to think so too. I absolutely agree. Because in the movie, Capote visits Perry and Dick several times. They have some, like, very intense emotional confrontations. There's a connection between them very immediately. And that's based off the obvious bias that Capote has for Perry in the book. Like, in the movie, when he's walking up the courthouse, you see their eyes meet, and it's like, oh, there's a moment there. And it's so interesting because, like I said earlier in this podcast, they met in person 4 or 5 times, maybe. Yeah. They communicated via letter, but I mean, those emotional confrontations did not exist the way the movie portrayed them. And it's so fascinating how the movie shows them as foils to one another. After meeting with Perry a few times, Hoffman's Capote describes their relationship as, it's as if Perry and I started life in the same house. One day he stood up and walked out the back door while I walked out the front. With some different choices, he's the man I might have become, which is such an interesting way of explaining the sort of bias that he has for him. And like I described earlier, the end of this movie is Capote wrecked with guilt because he's supposed to be helping these people out, and he is instead waiting for them to be killed so he can finish his book that is, like, eating him alive, it's fascinating because it takes that story structure of Capote's life and filters it through the nonfiction novel lens as well. You know, there is basis for these things. There's basis for Capote and Perry's relationship and the odd sort of connection they had with each other, this very complicated relationship. And it does what Capote does with Perry, which is inject that, like, artistic interpretation of what that was. It talks about, again, them being the sort of different sides of the same coin, that sort of idea. And it just injects that creativity, that artistry into this existing story, which wildly changes it. And that's fine. It's like it creates something very different from what is real life. But who's more deserving of that than the man who made that such a big part of his legacy? You know what I mean? It's a brutal case of, like, taste of your own medicine. You know, it's so...
It feels like a game of telephone, but through a telescopic photo lens, where, like, you're zoomed in all the way and you have the actual event, and then you zoom out a little bit and you have Capote's retelling of the event through his own ideas of what might have happened. Mm-hmm. And then you have, let's zoom out a little bit more, and then you have the movie dramatization of the writing dramatization of the real event. It's like, okay, where even are we? What happened? What actually happened?
And again, there's those cores that carry through, but it's like at some point, there's so many different things going on. It's just like, where does reality start and where does fiction end? And I think that's why the core of my paper was Richter's element of bad history, which is not necessarily lying or dishonesty. It's misrepresentation of what is true when what actually is happening is speculation, potentially wild speculation. Again, these are valid interpretations of what could have happened, but that's what they are, interpretations. And there's lots of different forms that those could take. Capote is presenting that as real. He's presenting his interpretations as the story. And I think that's sort of where the issue arises.
Were there any major surprises while researching your topic?
Yeah, I think what I was surprised by was, I mean, this is sort of a thing that surprised me in retrospect, was just how much people bought into that idea. You know, I know we talked about, like, obviously there were some people who were critical of the book upon release, but while I was digging through those reviews that came out right after, I mean, realistically, like, the majority of them bought into the idea. But it makes sense because, you know, I did too. when it first came out, I was like, wow, what a persuasive piece of literature. This was real. That's incredible. And, it took that further research and that more skeptical lens for me to sort of see those holes, see where that sort of started to fall apart for Capote. I think that, I would be so interested to see if one of those authors who had that high praise when it came out revisited the text and, maybe saw the arguments, the further research that people did to see how that sort of fell apart. So I think that's what surprised me, is just how persuasive the idea that this was real really was to people.
It reminds me of the marketing and the sort of cultural phenomenon around the Blair Witch Project, where it was like, this is found footage. This actually happened. And then you go see it in the theater, and there's even they even had like a newscaster opening up does it open up the movie, or is that just part of the marketing? I don't remember, but it's basically newscasters are like, this is real footage that we found, and here it is. And you're like, you really feel like this happened, and it makes the drama of the story way more impactful, because you're like, oh my God, this happened.
Yeah. And that's sort of how, again, going back to that other piece of literary journalism, Joan Didion's Democracy, it sort of does the same thing. It's presenting itself as real, even though it's entirely fictional. And what a persuasive idea. So engaging, so fascinating. And I think the main difference is just the subject matter that Capote tackles. It's like he's dealing with very serious things, dealing with very serious topics and talking about them. And he's misrepresenting the motives of the killer. He's speculating. And I think that's sort of where it comes into conflict with that persuasiveness, is that at some point it becomes a misrepresentation.
Why do you believe that this kind of research is essential?
Well, I think this is important because, it's such a cultural mainstay in popular culture right now. It's like these pieces of media are deeply entrenched into how we consume media. They're indicative of the culture of media that we're living through. I mean, that monster series with Jeffrey Dahmer, obviously, there's lots of good in that series. And it won several awards. Like, Niecy Nash-Betts won Best Supporting Actor for her role in the series. So these pieces of media are being recognized on that stage. That's their stage now. And it's important, I think, to be critical of how they are presenting themselves when they're going to be put on such a big pedestal as huge pieces of entertainment. Especially when, with documentaries, there was a story in the news 3-4 days ago about Netflix using AI generation in one of their true crime documentaries.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's great.
Which is, I mean, we don't have time to get into all of that, but that is nuts. And I think that's an evolution of what Capote started. Unfortunately, it's a radical version of it. But I mean, you see the seeds there. And when these things are possible, I think it's important to have that critical lens and understanding of how these pieces of media are functioning and how they're telling their stories.
What led you to pursue a degree in the humanities in the first place?
I mean, I think it's just that I always loved reading and writing. And I think, books, media, storytelling have always been such a big part of my life. When I came here to think about what I wanted to do further, I tossed around a lot of different potential subjects. And I just kept coming back to, I just want to enjoy what I do. And I enjoy this. I think this is fascinating to talk about and also important to talk about. It's the humanities today are more important than maybe they've ever been because they're sort of being culturally undervalued. It really is necessary to sort of, again, to do what you're doing with this podcast, Dan, and talk about the tangible research that they're doing and the importance behind it. Getting to be a part of that is really kind of special and interesting and a fun thing to pursue going forward in my education and career.
Oh, well, thank you. That's so nice.
Yeah.
What do you intend to do with your degree and this project in the future?
Yeah, so I'm taking a little bit of time off from school just to sort of reorient myself. We started school during COVID. Feels like I've been going forward nonstop for a long time. So I want to...
But for clarification, you're not quitting. You are graduating this semester.
Yeah, I'm graduating this semester. Yes. I'm graduating. I'm taking a little bit of time off after that. I'm going to, hopefully, I've been talking with my advisor, Dr. Harris. We're going to hopefully get this published in an undergrad journal, polish it up for that, make it look all nice and pretty, and then have it there.
Yeah, that's very exciting.
I know. I can't... It's so weird to think about. I'm like, it's like author? It's like, that's weird. Yeah, it's going to be exciting. And I'm going to take a little bit of time off to, make some money, really reorient myself around my hobbies, try to do a little bit of self-discovery, I guess, and then come back at it with a reinvigorated passion. And hopefully, I've been thinking about pursuing a degree in journalism, part of which has been invigorated by my research into this project. Yeah. I mean, it really is just such a fascinating thing. And I'm so happy I undertook this because it really did not only prove that I could do something like a large-scale academic project and succeed at it, but really reoriented my interest and sort of gave me a way forward. So I'm really excited for the next couple of years. I think it's going to be I'm really happy with where I'm at and where I'm going.
That's awesome. What gives you hope right now for the future of the humanities?
Again, I think it's just how important we are and how relevant we are today. Like it or not, what we do in the humanities is everywhere, and it's so pervasive. We are a huge part of what makes the world function. And seeing that sort of cultural devaluation of what we do is depressing, especially, again, I've talked a little bit about AI just because obviously it's the thing right now. But I think optimistic about that, because when people start using those sort of shortcuts to inject them into like popular media and popular culture and putting those things on a pedestal, I don't think those are strong enough to not fall apart. And I think people are going to see that, and then that will relight the idea of how important the humanities are and how important writers and actors and artists and musicians and all sorts of creative people, how important they are to everything that affects us culturally.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's well put. We always end with the same question. What is the best book that you've read recently?
Okay. I was thinking about this. Obviously, I've been hard at work. I haven't had a ton of time for just light reading on my own, sort of away from school. But luckily...
This is always a hard question for the students. They always come in, they're like, I haven't read anything for fun in, 3 years.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited for that to change soon. Again, I'm going to knock some books off my to-do list. But for class, there was this book we read that was so fascinating in my senior sem with Dr. Schweninger called... It's funny. I was talking earlier about a book called Democracy by Joan Didion. This is a book called Democracy by Henry Adams.
Oh, yeah, nice.
So it's going to be a little confusing. But I really loved this book, mostly because I feel like I'm fairly politically cognizant, and I'm interested in sort of how those machinations function. And that's sort of what Henry Adams is talking about in his book. Basically, what this is this woman called Miss Lee comes to Washington to sort of see how politics function from the inside, touch the machine. The engine room, I think, is the terminology he uses that sort of facilitates the country. And it's really interesting because she runs into this senator, Mr. Radcliffe. And, oh man, this dude is just the most devious. I mean...
He's a politician.
Exactly. I mean, and that's, into Adams, he is the politician. He embodies the sort of idea of what that is. And the story is really interesting because it starts off very lofty, discussing how things work, and they go to senatorial things, and I realize this probably doesn't sound very exciting, but he does transition into more character-based stuff towards the second half of the novel. But what I really love about this book is Adam's voice in it. He's so upfront about how he feels about these things. His level of wit, how he portrays these characters, the narrator's voice, how he portrays Radcliffe especially as it could not be more obvious that this is just the most scum of the earth guy, on top of all his political controversies and political schemes. And, he is a criminal in the truest sense of the word. He fudged his election to get into office. Adams just relates him. He uses all this devilish imagery. It's just a fascinating portrayal, and all that on its own would be its own thing. But it's a really funny book, which you wouldn't expect from an 1850 novel about politics. But it's devilishly laugh out loud funny, and I truly couldn't recommend it enough. So huge shout out to Dr. Schweninger for making us read this book. I truly enjoyed it so much. I love that wit. I love that dark humor about taking the very real things that affect so many people and just lampooning them here and back, cover to cover. You know what I mean? It was just a really great read. So truly highly recommend that for anyone listening.
Aidan Healey, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun to talk about.
Relevate is produced each week by Audacious Media and the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Today's episode was hosted, produced, and edited by myself, Daniel Charles Wright, and executive produced by Dr. Megan Sweeney. Special thanks to Randall Library and the excellent people at the Digital Makerspace for lending us their studio. If you have a project, a paper, or a topic that you'd like to discuss on the podcast, and you're a faculty member or a student of an accredited college or university, please send us an email at relevatepod@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.